Today we have Professor Serena Hussain in our studio. She is professor in Coventry University, UK. I, Jitin D. Soni, on the behalf of our organization, warm welcomes Professor Serena Hussain here. She is going to share her experiences and expertise on the area of international migration with special focus on Muslim diaspora. Ma'am, my first question is, what are the changes you see or you perceive in identity construction of Muslim diaspora in Western world?
So there has been a very significant change in terms of the way that Muslims are identifying, and much of this is in relation to global events that have had a very sort of local impact. So I'll talk you through the case in the UK, because this is the one that I'm familiar with the most. So although there was migration of Muslims prior to, say, the end of the colonial period, the real sort of significant migration of Muslim diasporas happened, I would say, sort of around the late 1950s, so post-partition, post-independent of British colonial states. And it was really part of a UK British government initiative to recruit skilled and unskilled labour to rebuild the economy, the infrastructure after the Second World War. Many academics comment that the Indigenous population of the UK refused to do many of those jobs. And as a result, there was a huge shortage in labour. So, of course, Britain looked to its former colonies, firstly and foremostly. As a result, there was a large-scale migration from India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, but also from the West Indies. So we have a sizable Afro-Caribbean population in the UK as well. Of course, before this, there was migration from Ireland, but in terms of the numbers, it just simply wasn't enough to be able to facilitate the kind of rebuilding that needed to happen very, very quickly after the war. So when those diasporas came in, or those migrants came in, and I think it's appropriate to call them migrants at that point, because I don't think many of them expected to settle in the UK permanently. They saw it as a very temporary a period of economic growth for them, yes, gains. You find that there were pockets from particular parts. So if we're talking about the subcontinent, and this is what I'm going to talk about because this is where the majority of the initial Muslims came from, they came from particular pockets, and they were classified, I suppose, officially in terms of the nation states, the new nation states that they came from. So their ethnic categories very much wrote the script for their identity in the way that they were identifying themselves. So they very much sort of slotted themselves into official categories and how they were being perceived by their host society and their host government. However, so yes, so it was very clear that we had Pakistani, Bangladeshi, Indian identities. So these were the kind of the main identities that Muslims were described to, not their religious identities. This was very much seen as something for the private sphere. It was about personal belief and spirituality, but it really didn't take on any kind of socio-political form in any way. It wasn't utilized for that purpose at all. But the identity also reflected very much the way that the host society was accommodating these new migrants. So when they first arrived, of course, there were no policies to protect these migrants in terms of racism. So if we think about identity as many social scientists do, we use identity to mobilize people for social action. So identities that were being formed for Muslims were the same identities that were being formed for other non-ethnic European heritage groups. And that is that if you're not white, you're black. It was a very simple dichotomy. So particularly in the 80s, there was sort of a black movement, a black political movement, and as I said, anyone who wasn't white would fit within that sort of that struggle, and it was very much about recognition and having legal protection to the fullest. But actually, social scientists, particularly my former supervisor, I was incredibly fortunate to have a leading expert supervise my PhD, Professor Tariq Madood. He was really one of the first people to do very, very nuanced research on migrant groups who we can now call diasporas, because they were now beginning to come into the second generation. So we now had British-born populations who were originating from South Asia. And actually what he found was quite interesting differentiation in terms of the way that people viewed themselves, but also in terms of social trends. So prior to this, we'd now had sort of the black political movement, but within that there was a distinction of black, i.e. Afro-Caribbean, and Asian, and all Asians were grouped together. Asian in the UK context means South Asian. So it's not like Australia and it's not like the US. The Chinese had their own category. So the Chinese were never viewed as Asian in terms of this particular label. It was reserved specifically for South Asians. But again, within the Asian, we were finding quite nuanced sort of social trends and the way that people were perceiving themselves. So I would say that sort of by the 90s, certainly, there's evidence to show that second generations were starting to think about themselves as Muslims. So religion was becoming more salient in terms of an identity item. So before 9/11, this was happening before global events. And I think the reason for this is fairly clear. It's very well trodden ground in terms of research and empirical findings. There were several things happening. What people tend to forget when they think about Muslims in Europe is that we have indigenous European Muslims. And when we were growing up in the 90s, there was an extended period when we would turn on our television and we would see horrors of the war of the former Yugoslavia. And there was mass ethnic cleansing of Muslim Bosniaks. And these are indigenous to Europe. And I think it was probably one of the first times that Muslims in Europe, who were migrants or not migrants, could see the horrors of what we would now call Islamophobia, but of mass killings, mass discrimination in its most kind of brutal form based on religion. Yeah. And I think it made people within sort of diaspora communities a little bit more aware of the fact that one can be differentiated on the basis of religion. Of course, it happened with the Holocaust, but it happened again. Yeah. So I think this was really significant. People sort of started thinking about their religious identity a little bit more and what that could mean for marginalization. But also, there was a very, very clear, very assertive movement within university campuses in the UK. There were a couple of groups, actually it's the same group pretty much, but it changed names because it was banned and seen as problematic. But there was a group, a student activist group called Hezbollah. Essentially it was influenced by, I suppose, what you would call sort of Salafi Wahhabi rhetoric. This rhetoric was prominent in the UK amongst second generations because it produced literature in English. Now remember, the sources for religion that our parents were using were incredibly different to the sources for religion that their children were using. Yeah. These were Saudi-esque based kind of ideological ideas about what it is to be a Muslim and what it is to not be a Muslim. And I think this was quite influential in drawing boundaries and thinking about Islam in different ways. And something very interesting happened. I think it's interesting and unfortunate simultaneously, but it was very, very common for young second generation Pakistani, Bangladeshi, Indian Muslims to say to their parents, you don't know what Islam is. You come from a illiterate, sort of a non-Islamic environment. Yes, absolutely. That was very heavily influenced by Hindu culture. You have no idea what authentic Islam really is, but we do, because we have these wonderful resources. So in some ways it's quite tragic, but in other ways it was actually a really important step, I think, in terms of developing a sense of identity amongst the diaspora. Because prior to that, I do think that second generation young people of sort of Asian heritage probably struggled quite a lot to find a place within society. So of course they were born and raised in the UK. They felt very British. I personally believe that we are more British than we are Asian. I mean, we're completely socialized from pretty much the beginning. We go through a very sort of systematic education process. So, there was this real conflict, and I scoff at the term, sort of caught between two cultures or a clash of cultures. I think that's too crude. We knew how to negotiate both cultures very, very well, but it still left a vacuum. We didn't really know where we belonged because we weren't white, Indigenous, British, but also we didn't think the way that our parents thought, and we had very different views about things. So having a third identity, a global Muslim identity, becoming part of a Muslim diaspora provided an alternative identity. So this had already started to happen before 9/11.
As you worked on UK, United States of America, as well as on Australia also. So my next question is that how we can compare space and identity for Muslim community in Europe, USA and Australia?
Well, I think the biggest difference is the countries of origin are different. So in terms of the dominant groups in each location, the countries of origin are different. So that reflects the identity, but it also reflects the experience. So for example, as I said, the majority of Muslims in the UK originate from South Asia, although that has changed significantly. We've had subsequent waves of migration coming in from all over the world, from Iraq, from Somalia, from Lebanon.
Still it is dominated by the
But still it is.
Asians.
Over 50%, absolutely. I would say quite possibly 60% is a safe estimate. In Australia, the dominant Muslim group are Lebanese in the south. In the north, it's Indonesian in the Northern Territory, so Indonesia, Malaysia. And in the US, it's quite mixed, but the community that I worked in was in North Carolina, and a very sizable Palestinian community. The way that those migrants entered as well has a significant implication on how those communities are doing, how they view themselves. So in the US, they were absolutely more middle class, highly skilled. In the south of Australia, in the UK, they didn't enter as skilled migrants. In the case of the Lebanese, of course, it was post-conflict. In the case of South Asia, they came in as unskilled or with very limited sort of skills. So that's had an impact on their sort of their trajectories. So even if we look at Australia, the north of Australia, we have highly skilled migrants who live in very wonderful suburbs and who are very, very well integrated. And in southern Australia, the journey has been quite different for the Muslims there. So not only the sending country, but also the circumstances in which people migrated had definitely had a knock-on effect on the way that people organize themselves, view themselves, and their current sort of socio-economic.
As well as the accommodative nature of the host country also?
Yeah, absolutely. And I can say that definitely in relation to Europe. So the policy in the UK, the multicultural policy that has been so heavily criticised, and I think that the criticism is unfounded, because actually I think that policy was really incredibly beneficial for the social mobility of migrants in the UK, of diaspora communities in the UK, it was accommodating. There's a lot of talk about it facilitating segregation. I mean, the evidence really isn't there. If we look at spatial analysis, it's simply not true. We don't have any ghettos in the UK. This is a myth. It serves political, rhetoric, but it's really unfounded. So we had more of sort of like I would say, an integration policy, whereas in other places the policy was very much assimilationist. And France, you can say, followed this kind of policy in the sense that France will treat you equally as long as you're French. So there was a real emphasis on leaving behind your sort of cultural identity and becoming as French as possible. That wasn't the case in the UK. Diversity was welcomed. In fact,
but with welcoming diversity, they are more inclined towards assimilation rather than accommodation, right?
No, that wasn't the case in the UK. They absolutely promoted. Oh, absolutely. In case of France, yes. Yeah. To be French, you must become French. Yeah. So that was the case, and so those policies have had an impact, and there is segregation in France for certain. Yeah. My last question is that how you look future Muslim international migration? That's a difficult question because Europe is in a very difficult, undergoing a very difficult phase at the moment. We've seen an increase in the far right, sort of political parties. What were far right have now sort of become centre in many ways, and it's a very difficult time to predict anything. The reason I say that is because we wouldn't, I think so many of us were genuinely shocked at the outcome of the Brexit referendum. Now that that's happened and we're leaving the EU, we're now faced with Scotland demanding another referendum and the potential of the union breaking up. So just to give you a sense that things are so unpredictable that it's very difficult to sort of make those forecasts when we're sort of on such rocky ground. However, one thing that I did want to say is we've seen that there's been the migrant crisis from Syria. Obviously, there's been an influx of refugees. This topic has been treated in a much more difficult, much more harsh way than previous refugee crises. I mean, we've had refugees coming in from Iraq, as I said, from Lebanon, from Somalia. It didn't cause nowhere near as much anxiety amongst the sort of the local populations in Europe. So it's almost like that happened under the radar. So I think public discourse, the way that the media has presented it, but also the way that sort of these political parties have presented it, has had an influence on migration from Muslim lands coming in. But one of the reasons that many Muslims in the UK voted for Brexit was because they felt that there was an unfair policy on migration in Europe. So it gave priority to European migrants, even including Eastern European migrants. Some felt at the expense of Asian migrants or migrants coming from elsewhere in the world. So it really depends how post-Brexit plays out and what policies the government adopts. So whether it's sort of a points-based policy on migration and it takes individual cases based on merit rather than saying, people who come from this country will be given priority rather than that country. So that we don't know. It's really difficult to answer. But what we do know right now is that any kind of lobbying, any of the European governments to take in more Muslim migrants will not work. So for the time being, it's not looking great. But these things change. So
thank you, Professor Serena. You shared with us on your views on this burning issue. You are working in this line from last 2 decades. We are really happy to have your views here. Thank you. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome.